Everything changes. The process philosophy of Peter Kropotkin. Uh, just starting here with this, we have in various texts, not just by post anarchists like Saul Newman and Todd May, but we can also find it in many other places. This interpretation of Kropotkin and of many other classical anarchists, that they have this view of an essentialist view of human nature, that the human are underneath, in their core, have like a good essence. Sociality and social behavior, morality, is something that is deeply ingrained in us, and that this essential human nature is just distorted by the state, by institutions of power, and that if these institutions would disappear, then we would just automatically, naturally be good. This is a pretty, I call this nonsense, because we don't actually find that supported in pretty much any of the classical anarchists, maybe with the exception of William Godwin. And the view has been disputed by Benjamin Franks, Alan Antliff, Matthew Adams, and many, many others. The idea is that Kropotkin especially has this one-sided view of human nature that is based on a reading of mutual aid, that which is, yeah, this is a false interpretation. But what I want to do is a little more than just saying that Kropotkin has a more nuanced view of human nature. He basically doesn't have a view of human nature, like an essentialist view of human nature. What Kropotkin does not just say that there's humans both have mutual aid and sociality, and also like aggressive tendencies. He's basically rejects a view of human nature as like some kind of core, some kind of essence. What he says is that we have a multitude of separate faculties, of autonomous tendencies. There's various things in our minds, in our bodies, that are all constantly interacting, fighting, pushing each other. And none of them are the essence. None of them are a core. None of them are the primary one. So this is a rejection of any fixed human essence in or any core of the human mind. So I think this goes a little further than just saying that that Kropotkin has a more complex view of the human psyche, of the human nature, that contains, both good and bad. No, he's rejecting the idea of a human core, of an essence, of any fixed way of any fixed nature. All of these different separate faculties that he sees in the human mind are constantly interacting, and that means that the human itself, in a human individual, is constantly changing. We're constantly becoming something new. And this is a view that this is not just his view of the human psyche, it's a view that permeates all his writings, which covered an endless number of topics. The view that stability and harmony are only temporary phenomena, that everything only exists because of infinite forces pulling in different directions, and that everything must therefore change, was not just something he observed in his studies of glaciers, natural climate change, and evolution, which are fields he contributed to, or his reporting on other scientific discoveries such as astronomy, geology, and physics, it was a principle he saw as fundamental to the world itself. It was his metaphysics. Change and constant modification is not just a feature of the world to Kropotkin. It is also the principle of life itself. To live is to constantly become. If we stop changing, if we stop moving, we die. The same goes for the universe and the sun, everything. It's quotes like these. I hope you can all see the quotes, so I don't have to read them out loud. Um, Quotes like these can be found throughout Kropotkin's writings, whether it's on philosophy or recent science, moral and political theory, or anarchistic agitation. These quotes have convinced me that Kropotkin should be considered what is called a process philosopher. Don't worry, I will try to explain what that means. But first, let me note that this, interestingly, puts him in the same philosophical camp as people like Nietzsche and Gilles Deleuze, thinkers the post-anarchists tend to identify more with and see as antithetical to so-called Enlightenment humanists like Kropotkin. Process philosophy is often said to have started some 2,500 years ago with the philosopher Heraclitus. He was arguing against the Greek philosophers who tried to find the basic components of everything, the atoms which everything is made of, and that are constant and never changing, the essence of stuff. That would this attempt to find something solid would give order to the universe. Heraclitus rejected this search. He thought everything is constantly changing and that there are no static atoms, just a process of interaction, contrasts, and oppositions which together create the universe. I want you to note the similarities with what Heraclitus here is saying with the previous quote by Kropotkin. Heraclitus is famous for the quote, "You can never enter the same river twice, because the river is not the same and neither are you." And as Kropotkin said, what we see around us is only a passing phenomenon. Another process philosopher is Friedrich Nietzsche, who is, of course, a favorite among post-structuralists and post-anarchists. And throughout Kropotkin's writings, there's occasional mentions of Nietzsche, and you can sometimes see some places where he engages with Nietzsche without quite coming out and saying it. And so these have always interested me because it's a little hard. You can see that he's talking to people who have read Nietzsche, and I'm not sure how, often not sure how, what is Kropotkin's own view, because sometimes he's just takes on the position of someone in order to be able to, persuade them better. Seeing the process elements in Kropotkin's thinking makes it clear that he is actually quite close to Nietzsche, even though they disagreed on a lot of things politically and morally. But he shares this view, the process view, the view based in Heraclitus. Nietzsche also agreed with Heraclitus. That the search for something permanent, a substance underneath everything, is to be rejected. And Nietzsche also, like Kropotkin, was greatly inspired by Darwin and the theory of evolution, which also he thought changes everything, changes the way philosophy should be done. The doctrines of sovereign becoming, this quote, is Nietzsche's reaction to the theory of evolution, that becoming is now what the fundamental part of ontology of being. Instead of being, which is substance, which is something stable, we're talking about constant becoming. Our nature is constantly becoming new. All concepts are fluid. Species are fluid. There are no clear boundaries. So there is no substance to like what is human. And this is elements that Nietzsche took from Darwin, and this is also what we can find in Kropotkin. The word process philosophy, to my knowledge, doesn't really appear until the 1920s, I think. Is Alfred North Whitehead, a mathematician and philosopher, who I think was the one who coined the term process philosophy. And he's the one who first tries to make a coherent, like, full philosophy based on these ideas, which is the idea that we reject substance. We reject the idea that there is something like a fixed substance underneath everything, that everything is made of, but it instead look to that everything that exists is a constantly changing phenomena based on interaction and difference. So difference is also what we find in Deleuze and Guattari, who both take this idea from Whitehead, from Nietzsche, etc., and say, what if we, instead of starting with identity, what if we start with difference? That difference is actually the fundamental part of the universe, or of nature, of being. That instead of being first, that, or identity, then difference is what creates movement, creates life, creates everything that exists. Difference as in the interaction of things that are, sorry, that I am not what I am first. I am what I am as a result of constant interaction with things that are different from me and from within me. Okay, maybe this wasn't very clear. So here's a bit of a little bit of a summary on overview. Process philosophy is the opposite of what we could call substance philosophy or substance ontology. So the key elements are: process philosophy prioritizes difference over identity, change over stability, becoming over being, and sees everything as constituted by a multitude of forces instead of one underlying substance. All of this puts Kropotkin clearly in the camp of process philosophy, not substance. Kropotkin sees humans and everything else as non-stable temporary phenomena made of a multitude of interacting forces, which means we are constantly changing. Difference, diversity, is the primary element that keeps the process of life going, not stable substances with fixed essential qualities. This means it's absurd to throw him into the camp of essentialist Enlightenment humanists, as so many have done. He has more in common with post-structuralists. But what does this mean for how we might talk about anarchist futures through the lens of Kropotkin? One thing we can know is that for Kropotkin, an anarchist society can never be fully harmonious and free of conflict, and it should never try to. Because, as we have discussed, movement and change is life, and for there to be change, there must be difference and variety. We should therefore not be afraid of conflict, even in an anarchist society, because conflict, criticism, counter-criticism, etc., and a multitude of conflicting forces is what makes a society thrive and forces it to adapt, to keep moving, to live. Another criticism of Kropotkin is that his view of history is mechanistic and deterministic, that our good human nature will at some point prevail and anarchism is inevitable. For example, his friend and comrade Malatesta thought it was a problem that Kropotkin wanted to see the same principles in society as in nature, as if human society develops according to some natural laws and human activity is irrelevant. But if we interpret Kropotkin as a process philosopher, then we get a different view. Yes, the same principles are underpinning both human society and nature in general, but they are not principles of linear, mechanistic, or deterministic unfolding of some fundamental and unchanging substance. They are the principles of a multitude of varied forces constantly interacting and adapting to each other in creative and unpredictable ways. It's therefore not possible to say what a future anarchist society will look like, any less than it is possible to predict the exact evolutionary development of a biological species. But what we can know is that both must be able and willing to change and to keep adapting if they want to be successful. So I will end with this rather long quote, uh, only because it goes nicely with a picture of the volcanic eruption of Fagradalsfjall here in Iceland, which just ended this week. This is, for Kropotkin, an example of what happens when a society is not willing to change, when it tries to hold on to its old forms and thus suppresses the forces and movements underneath. When these forces will eventually break through, and then the change will happen violently and abruptly. We don't know what the future holds. And in these times, it is hard for many of us to have much optimism and faith that it will be a positive one. But we can have this certainty, though: change will happen. The current society cannot stay the way it is. There will be an eruption. Now, how we change and whether we want this to be an abrupt and destructive change or something else, something that is nicer, that is up to not just us as individuals, but to society in general.